Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone, and welcome. Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is with great excitement and optimism that I have the pleasure, my friends, of convening this event on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States. The event is being held in the, in the margins of ECOSOC's Financing for Sustainable Development Forum. For this event, we have brought together a diverse grouping of economists, climate finance and development finance officials, civil society, United Nations agencies, and member states from both donor and recipient countries to discuss issues that for SIDS requires urgent attention and clarification. Excellencies, colleagues, the conversation that we are about to have today will be difficult. They might be even awkward, but ultimately, these conversations are necessary for progress in order to ensure resilience and the sustainable development of small island developing states. I am having a bit of a frog in my throat there. Excuse me. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda and the Paris Agreement both speaks to these development and climate finance in their respective mandates. While we can't divorce the two, we can create clear reporting and separation lines to track the level of support provided to small island developing states. My friends, we all want the same best thing for SIDS, who are recognized globally as the most vulnerable. We just maybe differ on how to get there. Crucially, however, what I think is no longer up for debate. It is that we all agree, my friends, that the status quo is simply deeply flawed and changes is absolutely necessary. And for those of you not yet convinced of this fact, deciding how not yet convinced of this fact, you will hear testimonials today from some of the member states that lay bare how current policy initiatives and current policy interventions across both climate and development finance, and undoubtedly have failed them. And you will hear the best from the best intentions are not necessarily easy. They are simply unfit for the purpose of dealing with the current crisis that many islands are currently dealing with. The paradigm of multiple converging crises has laid it up and showed us clearly that we need change. Colleagues, the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index, MVI, is on the verge of being finalized. And it feels like a glimmer of hope for us. And this is a hope for what has been a long, dark, winding tunnel of a journey. For us, small islands, this could be a real, a real moment, a turning point that finally allows us a fair shot of accessing concessional financing for our member states. As exciting as these developments have been, I must urge you to be cautious. We are not there yet. The MVI will not be a cure or a panacea, and the devil, of course, remains in the details, determining the makeup of the MVI and the agreeing universal measurable indicators to determine countries and rankings and use is one half of the battle. It's one half of the process. Deciding how the MVI is to be used and implemented in a practical sense is the other. The road to hell, they say, is paved with good intentions, and we cannot afford to converge, to once again consign the MVI into the same fate that has befallen so many great ideas. We cannot convert MVI into the dustbin of good ideas, and we can't make this a negative. Even negative real world consequences must not stop us here. We have to move forward. This is why opportunities for opening and frank discussions, such as these that we will have today, where we can come to the table as equals, are so important. I really, really urge all of you here, all of us, to take heed and listen to each other, to the experiences and the practical challenges being shared by members with you all here today, as this is ultimately what we must aim at to solve our challenges. I have the really great faith that we will reach that light at the end of the tunnel, and that today is another very important and sure footstep towards getting to the point where we all want to. I would like, my friends, excellencies, colleagues, to wish you all the best and be very, very, I look forward with excitement to a most fruitful and meaningful discussion. And I hope that we all leave here today with a little better understanding and clarity on the way forward that we want to go and the direction that we must go if we are going to get there. As one great writer said, if you don't know where you are going, you will end up anywhere. We know where we want to get to. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Webson, and good morning to everyone. We have a slight change in our agenda this afternoon. We're having some logistical issues with the keynote speaker, and so we will go straight into the testimonials. So welcome to the interactive segment of our discussions this afternoon. But before we get into the interactive panel discussion, it is important for us to hear from SIDS themselves. What are the difficulties they may be having? Part of the reason why we're here today is to learn and understand from the SIDS perspective. So we can listen to the conversation, and sometimes these conversations, as Ambassador Webson has pointed out, may not be easy. In fact, it may be difficult for some. But hearing the testimonial from SIDS will allow us to better understand the difficulties in accessing climate finance and development finance. The testimonials are coming from the 3 regions of SIDS. While our experiences are similar as SIDS, each region faces different challenges. Some are unique to that particular region. So we will begin with our first testimonial from the Maldives. Zoe from the Maldives.
Thank you, Tomasi. Uh, at the outset, let me just thank the permanent mission of Antigua and Barbuda as the chair of AOSIS for inviting the Maldives to participate in this and also contribute. Actually, for small island developing states, particularly for us, because we will speak today on the experiences as Tomasi highlighted we had. So for us, development and addressing climate change are often two sides of the same coin. Because it's inseparable, because the effects of climate change are very real and also existential issue for us. At the same time, we feel like benefits of development need to be felt by the people of small countries like ours. This means that often development projects and climate change adaptation and mitigation projects overlap and actually are part of the same projects. And I'll give some examples of this later on. For example, the construction of a harbor in an island like Maldives. As you know, we are just about, maximum height is 1.5 meters, is actually a development project for us. But the project will also include the construction of seawalls and shore protections at the island. So this is intended to both protect the newly developed harbor and also to protect the island from coastal erosion and shoreline degradation. So financing for harbor can be, we count as both development financing and also actually climate financing, leading to the possibility of sometimes kind of double counting, So one of the biggest obstacle for small states like ours is to address various development and climate changes is actually lack of both climate and development finance. And I think this has been mentioned repeatedly in various forums. So the country classification used by international financial institutions and the credit rating system by the international credit rating agencies pose a real challenge for small countries like the Maldives. For instance, we are, using the current criteria is higher middle income country. For that reason, since the graduation from LDC status, Maldives has actually lost preferential market access priority in ODA allocation and special eligibility for technical and financial assistance. But we all know the numbers always does not really show what is happening in the ground. For example, the Maldives has also lost other form of special support and benefits that was given to LDCs. However, due to our small economic base and limited natural resources, and due to the loss of access to ODA and concessional loans and debt relief, in fact, which is a huge, another completely a different topic, which we can talk a lot, but today I'm not going to focus a lot on that. So all these challenges actually negatively affects the credit rating of countries and pose further challenges to accessing development finance. And COVID-19 pandemic and its negative effects on the Maldives economy, for example, has actually compounded this. We lost almost 60% of our GDP, almost in 2020. So of course we are recovering, but this is just to show how vulnerable our countries are. And the other point I would like to make is that a graduation from LDC status has also meant that the Maldives is no longer eligible for tariff concessions for fisheries exports. This is a very interesting point because a lot of us, we talk about sustainable development, sustainable method of fisheries, and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, Maldives remains the only small island developing state that has tariff levied on its export to Europe, for example. At the moment, Maldivian fisheries exports to European Union is about 24%. And the United Kingdom is now at 20%. This is just because of LDC graduation. Because based on our current measuring criteria, Maldives is no longer eligible for, the leniencies we had before. This has been actually a huge obstacle for the Maldives to recover from the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and for the development alternative revenue streams. So we talk a lot about widening our revenue base. However, the reality is that it's very challenging for small island development states. And also this tariff means that the Maldivian fish exports are not able to compete with other fish exporting countries and is unable to gain a fair price for our exports. I have to say though, actually we have been, despite these challenges, we have been very lucky to some extent that we have very excellent relations with our development partners who have actually come to our assistance during our need in almost all the time. So, and have provided us continued support assistance to various schemes in the Maldives, whether it is renewable energy or whether it is, as I said before, related to development and climate adaptation projects. We have also benefited from the smooth transition process from graduation from LDC status, and that is something I also would like to highlight. So the difficulty, let me, if I have a few minutes, Tumasi, I don't know how many minutes is given for each, but I would like to talk a little bit more about climate finance. So the difficulty, sorry?
1 minute.
Okay, so the difficulty in obtaining climate financing does raise a question of regional in the development finance towards climate mitigation and adaptation, particularly adaptation in our case. So regional and development finance towards the adaptation can actually, if we focus, the point I'm trying to say is if we focus regionaling of development finance only to mitigation can actually exacerbate existing social issues in small states like the Maldives. For example, through this pandemic, government of Maldives focused on ensuring that the need of people are met. We spend a lot of money on COVID-19 pandemic, especially focusing on economic response and social and health response. We spend almost 116 million and 145 million respectively, both social, economic and social aspect. And as we all know, due to the dispersed nature of the Maldives and its population, providing basic necessity for our population is very, very challenging and very costly. If we have to regional these finances that we need to spend on economic recovery and health issues towards climate mitigation, then it would be, in fact, we have to stop all those because it would be catastrophic. We have to reallocate our resources for what is really, really important. So what we would argue is that we need to consider in the alternative indices, which I think Ambassador Epson has pointed out, which we are arguing is that the multi-vulnerability index should be used to allocate ODA, which will greatly benefit small island developing states. So if we keep on using the old methods of allocating resources or indices to allocate resources, then small states like the Maldives will continue to be disadvantaged, and we have to reallocate the resources from the social programs we run or climate adaptation programs we run to the other resources. Perhaps in conclusion, what I would like to say is that it is time for international community to set up a global fund or guarantee scheme to lower the cost for developing states like the Maldives to tackle global issues such as climate change. Access to more concessional climate financing is an absolute necessity for small island developing states, and reducing the cost of green, blue, and social impact bonds can go a long way in this regard. I don't want to repeat what has been out there now. There's a lot of examples of what needs to be done and what can be done. In other words, flexible financing option based on unique characteristics of countries on a particular situation rather than rigid frameworks and numerous attached commitments what we are really looking at is perhaps examples of pooling potential funds from regional windows, as well as exploring options to obtain credit enhancement from relevant agencies. These would increase possibility for small island developing states to obtain financing at a lower interest rate and ultimately assist in taking debt portfolio to a sustainable path through faster development and additional revenue stream. In conclusion, I look forward to the panel discussion and some concrete suggestions on some of the points we have made in this regard. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you for sharing the perspectives and the issues that Maldives is facing with the issue of graduation, the lack of access to concessional financing, development and climate financing, and also the fact that as you continue on your development pathway, you're ensuring that you're bringing the sustainability of the environment into play. We will now go back to the keynote address. We have Mr. Helgeti from the World Bank, who is here to provide a perspective on the World Bank. He is a senior climate change advisor. Mr. Helgeti, please, you could deliver your keynote address.
Thank you very much, and I have to deeply apologize for arriving late at this meeting. I'm very sorry about that, and thanks for the flexibility in the program. I wanted to start with a few things which we all agree but need to be said. I think the fact that we all acknowledge the fact that that climate change is an extremely unfair process, with this huge gap between who is emitting and has been emitting in the past and who is the most vulnerable. The fact that poor countries and poor people within every country are responsible for a very tiny share of emissions, while when affected by climate impact, not only are they losing more, but what they lose is much more fundamental in many cases, with people living in or close to poverty, having to cut on basic consumptions like food consumption, access to healthcare, access to education. So the unfairness is with us, and I think we have a lot of discussions about this unfairness, and the fact that everything we do on climate change should be designed so that it helps poor countries, vulnerable countries, poor people improve their situation, and that we should avoid at all costs to have climate action be an obstacle to the path out of poverty for people and countries alike. This question on poverty is compounded by the question of size, right? And in our meeting today, of course, this is a big question. In our work on what we call socio-economic resilience, which is the ability of countries to cope with damages from climate change and recover from them. There are many dimensions linked to the economic structure and so on, but what really matters is the question of size and the ability of countries to do their own risk sharing and their own support for the recovery. So smaller countries clearly are not in the same position as bigger ones. And that's especially the case for natural disasters and big shocks that affect countries at once. So we have those facts, we know them, but I think it's important to start from there. Now, in terms of how does that affect development? The World Bank, since the beginning of its work on climate change, has made the case that we're working on climate not because we have a new mandate to look at climate, but because our work is development and poverty reduction, and that we cannot achieve our goals on climate, on development and poverty reduction without taking care of this climate challenge. We have from the beginning tried to highlight the the synergies and the complementarity between climate action and development. Not so long ago, this question was framed mostly as a question of trade-offs. Should we invest in development or should we invest in climate? And we feel this was the wrong framing, and that's the change in technologies, on knowledge, on resilience and vulnerability, I think has only made the case stronger that we don't have to choose between development and protecting climate and building resilience, but this can all be done at once. If I start with adaptation and resilience, we have now more and more evidence that poverty is one of the main factors in vulnerability. So every time we reduce poverty, we're also reducing poverty. We also see that the world is going from crisis to crisis. So we also see that the ability to manage crisis, including disasters, including environmental crisis, is something that will accelerate global economic growth and growth in countries. So this, in adaptation and resilience, there is really no trade-off. If we look at the economics, we estimate that every dollar invested in resilience is bringing at least $4 in avoided costs. So this is a very good investment. And the question, of course, is that the challenge is not an economic challenge. It's a challenge of financing, and it's a challenge in governance. And the challenge in financing is particularly strong, again, for smaller countries. When we did the climate vulnerability assessments of Fiji, one of the very clear finding was that you have a high vulnerability that creates a lot of recurring costs, like in the maintenance of the transport system. And those costs makes it even more difficult to find the resources to invest in resilience. So you have this sort of like lock-in effect in a situation of lower resilience, more recurring costs, lower ability to invest. And the only way to break that circle is to at one point have access to financing that makes it possible to invest. I think mitigation is now almost the same thing. 15 years ago, green technologies were more expensive. It's not the case anymore. When we look at the best way of providing people with access to modern energy, renewable energy today is at the top of the list. Better transportation in cities, more resilient, all of that is really good for development. So for mitigation now, I think we have the same conclusion. It's not so much an economic challenge, it's really a financial challenge. We see a lot of projects that on paper should be commercially viable, but they are not occurring because of all of the obstacles in their financing. And so what we're trying to think of is how do we use our own World Bank Group balance sheets to just make more of those commercially viable projects actually happening on the ground. And that's especially trying to manage risks so that we can increase the attractiveness of those projects. But I wanted to flag here, we have a blog post on that topic published last week on the fact that we cannot do without concessional resources to help unlock some of those barriers. One is on planning and the preparation of projects. We know that a lot of projects cannot just get to the point when you can finance them because it's very difficult to pay for the very early stage design. And we are using some of the concessional resources that we have to help projects get to the point where they can be financed. There are some projects that really require additional revenues, especially when they contribute to climate change mitigation. And we have other sources of funding that we use for that purpose. Maybe carbon markets can also help with that, but it won't replace a climate finance that is easy to access and can help with those projects. But I think one of the point that was maybe underestimated in the past is the need for resources to help with the transition. And in all countries, because of climate change impacts or because of the transition to green energy, we'll have people losing their jobs, we'll have communities losing livelihoods. And here we'll need some support from the international community to help those communities build back, create new livelihoods. So I think now we have a much better idea of how we can use climate finance to just help with the transition and to make it happen. even though we have to acknowledge that the resources, the volume is just not sufficient for the transition we're talking about. I just wanted to conclude on this question of finance and climate finance. I think in this question, there are three different questions, right? There's who provide resources, who receives resources, and how we use those resources. On this last part, how we use the climate finance, I think we want to make the case that it has to be completely blended with development. So the more we can blend these resources when we implement a project, so that we do resilient development, we do resilient transport, we do resilient energy, and so on. Blending makes it more efficient and much better mainstream in development. How you spend it has no relationship with who is providing this money and who is accessing it. And on those two dimensions, it's very obvious that compared with a pure development question, climate has a very specific considerations in terms of emissions and in terms of vulnerabilities. So I guess our conclusion is really this needs to separate the different questions. This discussion is about the difference between the development and the financing argument. I think, and I think on the actual delivery of those resources on the ground, we need to make sure everything is mainstream, everything is consistent, and everything is driven by countries' development priorities. In terms of where the money comes from and where it goes, this is where the taking into account vulnerability and climate change emissions become really important. But keeping those two topics very separated can ensure that we are both fair and just in terms of who pays and who gets supported, but also efficient in terms of having the development we need on the ground. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Halgati, and the intervention you made was quite timely, and I would say the points that you made were in fact justified. We do understand that it's important for us, especially as small states, to clearly define what is development finance and what is climate finance. But I think the broader issue for us, and this is where much of the discussion will continue on later, while there's a clear separation and understanding that as we continue into our development pathway, that a lot of times development finance and climate finance would perhaps intertwine. For us, the bigger issue of access and access in terms of graduation, number one, but there's also this notion that perhaps there's not enough financing out there in itself to accommodate the needs of small states. And I think what we have seen from the recent crisis is that perhaps there's enough money there to address much of our concerns, but how we access that money is quite important. And the work that the World Bank is doing in trying to provide this pathway for access for small states is important. So I would allow you to come back in later on in the discussion if you may have additional points. So we will go back now into listening to the testimonials from the small states. And we will now hear from the Ambassador of Nauru on the challenges that Nauru is facing on the ground. Ambassador?
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Excellencies and colleagues, for giving me the floor. And also let me at the outset thank you for organizing. Thank AOSIS Chair for organizing this very important and timely event. I am pleased to be here to share some of our views from Nauru's perspective, a national perspective. So like other SIDS and mostly probably the Pacific SIDS, Nauru is totally vulnerable to the impacts of adverse impacts of climate change. I would also like to raise the point that we've identified climate change represents the single greatest global threat to both the well-being, the livelihoods of our people, and of course, our security. Climate change and its effects, maybe the slow onset, the loss and damage, all these further increases our vulnerability and undermines our very efforts towards sustainable development. Having said all of this, as a small country, we are taking necessary steps to adapt to secure the future of the next generation. We have made headways in climate change adaptation policies as well as ambitious mitigation strategies laid out in our Nauru energy roadmap. And we also have begun hard work matching rhetoric and reality with the implementation of Nauru's first solar farm, which will we hope to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and complete construction of our climate resilient port facility that's in development right now. So many of Nauru's key assets are vulnerable to mostly coastal related hazards, which include sea level rise, coastal erosion, storms, water intrusion, and flooding, which are projected to intensify as the impacts of climate further exacerbates all of these vulnerabilities. Therefore, one of our long-term priority right now is to relocate key infrastructure and people to a higher ground. And we've updated our NDCs to put the Higher Grounds Initiative as a forefront of our climate action. However, as we all do this, it is clear that financing continues to be critical to meeting our ambition and our climate action on the national front. Well, there's some progress has been made. It goes without saying that there's more that needs to be achieved, and we don't have the time on our hands to ensure and enhance our resilience. Nauru has been recently reclassified as a high income country during the pandemic, which makes it more difficult and renders us ineligible to access any concessional financing. So this becomes detrimental to our national aspirations right now. So one of the points that we need to highlight is structural obstacles and such unique vulnerabilities are not considered or appropriately addressed by the international community. And these goals, where we put forward the Samoa pathway, all these UN agreements that we've agreed to, the 2030 agenda, all of these will be compromised and not be realized in terms of what we aspire to do. So to that end, as the chair has raised, we would welcome the ongoing work of the MVIs, focusing on SIDS, and we reiterate the importance of its establishment so that SIDS countries like Nauru can better be able to be represented and be able to access some of these concessional financing, or considering to access concessional financing that's available. So one of the things maybe I just want to raise here, so this is not a group agreement, but if those who are very much aware of what Nauru has done in the recent term is focus on the DSM area. And this is one of our economic alternatives as opposed to a new industry that we're focused on. But one of the key elements of why we've moved into this sector is because we were one of the SG's energy champions, and we realized that the need to move towards a net zero future cannot be renewables alone. It has to be clean energy as well. And we need big countries to transform their energy transition to help us meet those goals. Otherwise, we're beyond the 1.5, which is now at a pulse level, 1.5 degrees Celsius. So I just wanted to highlight that. And then probably just a key point that I wanted to make was, at this moment, my delegation believes we need a fundamental restructuring of financing, of the global finance system or framework, to be grounded in principles of fairness and equity. And we need a system that enables nations to make substantial investments in infrastructure resilience building towards the climate change. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ambassador. Well, I fix my camera. Great. Thank you, Ambassador. And it's quite interesting that you've noted that now a population of almost 11,000 graduated into a high income status, not even middle income, but a high income status. And noting the vulnerability of Nauru and the onslaught of natural disasters, and a small country with such a small population cannot access concessional financing to rebuild in the event of the onslaught of natural disasters and the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think this is why we're engaging in discussion today, to hear exactly these challenges and to see how we can find a way forward. We will now hear the final testimonial it will be a video testimonial from Ambassador Hunt of Antigua and Barbuda, who is actually traveling now and is unable to provide the testimonial in person. If you could play the video. There is no sound to the video. Still no sound.
Concept. The end that we seek to achieve is a low emissions, climate resilience, global economy. To add to this definition, climate finance is viewed as the financial resources used primarily for adapting in anticipation for the adverse effect of climate change, mitigating the cause of climate change, and responding to the actual loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change. Climate finance is distinct and therefore additional to current and future development finance. For example, official development assistance and/or humanitarian finance. To understand these, this understanding is confirmed in Article 4.3 of the Climate Change Convention, outlining that climate finance must be new and additional finance. This includes new and additional to both development and humanitarian finance. Humanitarian finance main objective is really to solve international problems of a humanitarian character. The impetus for this support is therefore grounded in a general sense of humanity to help affected people that are suffering, among other things. And development finance main objective is to respond primarily to the economic development objective of a developing country. Both subsets of finance should be cognizant of climate change and should make their finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emission and climate resilience development, as outlined in Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement. Furthermore, finance that uses ODA eligibility criteria for access cannot be classified as climate finance. The COP under the UNFCCC has not agreed or established the use of ODA eligibility requirement for eligibility criteria for accessing climate finance as provided for in Article 11.3a of the Climate Change Convention. So the application eligibility criteria inhibits a number of particularly vulnerable countries, including small island developing states, from accessing climate finance. As a result, this shifts the costs of responding to climate change to the least responsible, most vulnerable, and with the least capacity, while alleviating, of course, our developed country partners of these legal obligations under the Convention and the Paris Agreement. So from a practical perspective, Antigua and Barbuda continues to be on the receiving end of this eligibility issue beyond the minute climate change finance from the multilateral climate funds that we have to fight for, the country is really provided with any bilateral climate finance because of the use of these criteria. It is especially the case for most extreme weather events. For example, when we were rebuilding and rehabilitating our road infrastructure post-Hurricane Irma in 2017, we could only get funds to execute to a business as usual, not to a climate resilience level. So in order to meet the incremental costs adapting to climate change in this infrastructure rehabilitation program, our island nation had to increase our debt burden through securing non-concessional finance. So I ask colleagues, is this fair for a particular vulnerable country to bear this undue burden? This conflation is not only unjust, but it goes against the fundamental principles and purposes of the international climate change treaties, as well as the obligated support needed to address this issue. Antigua and Barbuda certainly hopes that this testimonial allows partner countries to better understand the dire situation we're in, and that it inspires corrective actions in the appropriate fora to ensure prioritized access to new and additional climate finance for SIDS. This finance should also be predictable and adequate enough to address SIDS needs and priorities. I thank you.
And so we've just heard the final testimonial from Antigua and Barbuda. And so these three testimonials would give us enough food for thought and much to ponder on, and provide what I hope is a healthy appetite for interactive discussion with our esteemed panelists. Our panel members are quite diverse and brings a wealth of experience and understanding of the vulnerabilities of SIDS and the issues surrounding access to development and climate finance, but also a greater understanding of the rethinking finance, development finance versus climate finance, and why it matters. And from our perspective as the chair of AOSIS, we see the MVI as having an important role here in determining access. So we will begin our panel discussion, a very interactive panel discussion, mind you, with the resident coordinator for Samoa, Cook Islands, Niue, and Tuvalu, Ms. Simona Menescu. Simona, the floor is yours to provide an overview.
Thank you so much, Tomasia, and ambassadors, distinguished participants, a very early morning in Sydney, where I'm about to board a flight to Samoa. So this is why there is no fancy background here. Just a few thoughts first to acknowledge the importance of all the points made before. The work that we are leading across the SIDS on the multidimensional vulnerability index is meant to contribute to a major change into development financing overall. So we are going to produce the report on the MVI, and it will be accompanied by a document that would speak about the overall change that the financing system should encounter. And this is because the current development cooperation system was premised on the fact that development is a linear process and is an upward moving pathway, which is no longer the case. So now, because of climate change, because of risk related to health, the incidence of pandemics, as well as the changes in income distribution that technology and globalized competition have produced, are generating big disruptions. So we cannot keep a development finance system in place that considers that development is linear. That is that within the same income category, be they LDCs or low income or mid income, higher income, countries are not the same. So there is another assumption that the current system makes, that if you're a mid income country, in that category, you share issues, structural issues. To some extent, that may be true, but our MVI analysis shows that countries are quite distinct in these income categories. So this is why the MVI we put on the table is practically looking into ways of measuring distinctiveness. So first of all, not all countries within the same income category share the same issues. And the second distinctiveness is that there are factors that lead to vulnerabilities, that lead to losses, that lead to setbacks that could be addressed with policy and law, and some other factors that will never change, but countries could actually get better at managing them. Another point that we would put into the document that we are going to produce is precisely what the Maldives representative, the distinguished representative, put on the table, which is access to markets. At this point in time, when markets are under major stress, not only because of COVID, but also because of the big suppliers, Russia and Ukraine, being involved into a conflict, market access needs to follow different rules. So there is produce, there are commodities that are available in some other places, but those countries have no access to markets because of the current arrangements under the WTO system. So I think the world is at the point where those major global arrangements are going to be revised. And I need to say that we have seen from the OECD, from the World Bank, from financial institutions, an open thinking, if you wish, to sit together and come up with new arrangements. Let me make reference to also the key question here is whether we should disentangle or we should do anything with the current systems that we have, the development financing versus climate financing, to ensure we are advancing towards the goals we want to achieve. So I think a better word than disentangling here is ensuring that development financing and climate financing are more relevant to one another, a point that was also made previously by the World Bank. So we call development financing equity and debt and international financial flows such as grants, the ODA component. Seeds are facing challenges across the three. So there is limited investment, there is a high cost in servicing debt. It doesn't matter how big the debt is, the problem is the cost of that. And also on the ODA is declining, but disbursing ODA in small island states is 4.7 times more expensive than in other countries. This is an OECD report that was released called Making Development Cooperation Work for the Seeds. So we would like to see in development financing some major changes. The IMF put forward at this point in time this new instrument, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, that is already committing 45 billion for soft finance, concessional financing, soft loans made to developing countries for climate and for the pandemic in the first place. Of course, the fund aims to ensure that more resources are coming in, but initially SDRs are channeling through the RST as well. But I'm just reading from the criteria, the last line. So first of all, seeds will qualify because small states have a distinct line of eligibility, and if they are below $30,000 per capita per year, again, we are stuck with the GNI per capita, then seeds will qualify. But they qualify under certain eligibility criteria. So first of all is package of high quality resilience and sustainability trust supported policy measures, concurrent IMF program financing or non-financing, and the third one is sustainable debt and adequate capacity to repay the fund. But if seeds had that sustainability of that, they wouldn't need the money at all. So the issue right now is how do we tailor that to small island states, considering that in the analysis we produced, the MVI we have that is universal, seeds come at the top. And I spoke about that, and I'm quite sure everybody already knows the construction of our instrument. So we need to ensure that the financing instruments that are coming in are addressing needs. No longer development cooperation under the current principles is needs-based. So our MVI will be followed by an analysis as to how those structural vulnerabilities, those vulnerabilities that will never disappear, are generating losses and setbacks against the SDGs. And we will come up with a methodology that would allow countries to make that measurement all the time. And that will inform tailored instruments for the seeds. Let me just say that in this analysis, because we have already advanced, what comes out very clearly is that government spending, public spending per capita is linked to SDG progress, for instance. So seeds are at $7,100 US per capita per annum. And our analysis shows that to have consistent, systematic progress moving onwards towards the SDGs, the public spending per capita should be at $19,000 US and above. So that, of course, needs to be financed, and seeds do not have that capacity. And the plan is to ensure that, again, we add to the GNI per capita an indicator that allows us to identify the actual needs that vary from context to context, and based on that, to create specific instruments. And let me also say a few more things before in terms of the differences in financing. So first of all, the ODA has been, unfortunately, over decades, highly projectized. So it needs to have a different thinking. And it does have now with the new instruments that the United Nations has established, such as the Joint SDG Fund, where seeds have a distinct window. The same applies to some other instruments. At the same time, we also need to ensure that processes are much lower in terms of intensity and the time they take. So I would think that both development financing and climate financing are process heavy, unfortunately. I also believe that climate financing should go beyond those vertical instruments that are being established. We need to talk more seriously about carbon taxing. I'm a very strong proponent of carbon taxing that needs to be across the board, not in certain countries, because that would affect competitive advantage and trade. And that we would need to talk about carbon credits, and we would need to talk about seeds having access to a form of compensation to be able to deal with issues at hand at this point in time. So the panel, the high-level panel that the Secretary General established, seems to be very much in agreement that the MVI must be finalized, it must be simple, understandable, it must be exogenous in nature, identify things that make countries distinct, and that it should be then linked to the actual costs that vulnerabilities create, and access to financing to address those costs would be practically the resilience response that small island states need. So I would like to put on the record that I totally agree with Ambassador Webson as to what the MVI is about. So this is just the first step. It is great that we have an agreement, and we are going to have the MVI this year adopted, but much more is needed. And we do hope that member states in the adoption of the MVI will give us a mandate to move into the next phase of changing development financing. And whatever we have on the table right now would need to have distinct access points for small island states. Small island states do not have time. There is much more generosity of time for other contexts, but seeds do not have time. So unless distinct processes are in place, until we change the whole development financing, I don't think we are going to make progress. And let me close by saying that if development financing does not have a net zero marker to ensure that every dollar takes us to decarbonizing by 2030, halving emissions, and totally by 2050, reaching net zero, I don't think we are going to have any development at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Simona, for a very rich input regarding the MVI and the work that the RCs were doing in developing the MVI. And it is clear from your discussion that the MVI, if adopted and if utilized correctly, can assist in accessing development and climate finance, but also overall build the resilience of SIDS. We will come back to you, Simona. I know that you have to leave at 2, but we'll try to come back to you and pose 1 or 2 additional questions. But we will now perhaps want to move on to Dr. Velasquez from the Green Climate Fund. And I think it's important for you to jump in here to probably provide an overview of some of the access that is available to SIDS from the Green Climate Fund and whatever projects that the Green Climate Fund is working on, specifically targeted towards SIDS. Dr. Velasquez?
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Excellencies, thank you very much. We appreciate your invitation to the Green Climate Fund to this forum. Just an overview, we have committed so far $10.2 billion of resources from the GCF, and the share of those resources for the SIDS is 1.18 billion, as noted here. It's 45 projects. And in terms of readiness, in addition to projects that we have funded, we've also funded 152 readiness grants, out of which 116 of those have been disbursed. The value have been $96.8 million, and out of those, $44.8 million have been disbursed. In terms of SIDS engagement in 2022, our next board meeting, in fact, this May 2022, will be hosted by Antigua and Barbuda. There will be key and very important policy items that will relate to simplification and access that will be discussed at that board meeting. This includes the simplified approval policy, which focuses the ease of access of finance, including for the SIDS, and the adaptation approach policy. We hope that these gets adopted by our board at this meeting. In addition, in our last board meeting, which was in March, our board adopted the project-specific assessment approach, the PSAA, wherein any partner can now apply to submit a project and get accredited for that project. So they get accredited for that project without waiting for the usually very long process of getting accredited as an institution. In addition, we have also launched a digital accreditation platform for efficiency and enhance our complementarity and work with the GEF and other climate funds. In terms of implementation, over the years, we have actually gradually and over time, but very consistently improved our speed. As you can see from 2018, wherein we have averaged about 26 to 28 months from time of first review to first disbursement, we have now gone down to as low as a year, 12 months from the start of the review to first disbursement. And in fact, our fastest project ever in terms of approval to first disbursement have been in the SIDS. And this is the GCF project in Micronesia. It is the fastest ever. It only took 36 days from approval to disbursement. It's also an adaptation project in the SIDS. And during that ceremony, the president sent us a message, which we also put in our website. As an example of a project that we've also done in Micronesia. So in fact, in 2021, we had 2 projects approved in Micronesia that shows that it is possible to have projects, more than one per country per year. And this one is a SAP project, which promotes food security and farming in FSM. Also mentioned by the ambassador from Antigua and Barbuda. During the hurricanes, we also approved the project to actually build resilience of building sector in Antigua and Barbuda. This is providing funding of $32.7 million in grant from the GCF. You're more than please able to access our annual report, which just recently released. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Velasquez, for giving an overview on, or rather a preview on the work that the GCF is undergoing as it pertains to SIDS. And perhaps this is a great segue into allowing the next discussion to come into play. And so we'd want to hear the views on the work of the Caribbean Development Bank, and also from the bank perspective, the challenges that SIDS are facing. So we'll hear from Mr. Shelton Nichols of the Caribbean Development Bank. Shelton, please.
Okay, thanks a lot. And let me first of all thank the AOSIS chair for the opportunity to share some views from the CDB on the importance of vulnerability and resilience as key anchors for marshalling adequate development finance to access progress towards the attainment of the SDGs and indeed towards sustainable development. And I think it's important for us to start from this notion of sustainable development, because we've been hearing a lot of discussion about, development finance versus climate finance. Our focus at the CDB is on sustainable development, and we see that as building a resilient ecosystem that encompasses all dimensions of resilience: the social, the institutional, productive capacity, environmental, and financial resilience. Within our framework, of course, climate is just one of the elements. So, we see the need to look at sustainable development in a very holistic way. And I think that's a very important point for us to make at the start of this discussion. Like many developing countries, we recognize that gross national income, the metric that we are using for classifying countries for access to finance, does not adequately capture the process of development, and it does not map well to development financing in terms of the needs of the various countries, right? And we have seen this in past years, that many developing countries, especially SIDS, have been struggling to cope with the impact of a multitude of severe environmental shocks that have decimated their capital stock and productive capacity, even while they're trying to recover from the effects of the global financial shock and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. So it's against this background that we see the urgent need to make the MVI better by developing not just a framework that looks only at vulnerability, but importantly, taking into consideration the resilience framework and those components of resilience that I've just discussed. We see that as vital to supporting access to concessional finance for our countries. And therefore, we have been devoting quite a bit of our thought at the CDB to a measure called the Recovery Duration Adjuster, which is explicitly designed to take into consideration countries' initial conditions, that is the economic and social circumstances, as well as the infrastructure and support services in each country prior to a hazard or to a shock, to also take cognizance of the magnitude, severity, impact, and persistence of shocks, and most importantly, to also be able to build in that resilience capacity, to take account of the resilience capacity to rebound to the economic and social conditions that existed prior to that shock. So these, we think, are very important elements. So it's important to think about vulnerability as one important part of the framework, but we cannot stop there. We need to actually incorporate resilience in a very significant way if we are really to address the development challenges that SIDS and our countries are facing. I wanted to make a few points as well on why the RD framework can be considered as a real substantial upgrade of the MVI framework. Indeed, we can see the MVI framework as a first stage of our RDA, in the sense that the MVI framework looks at vulnerability. The RDA framework moves beyond that to look at both vulnerability and resilience. And there are some important points as to why we think this upgrade is crucial. First, our framework is holistic and multidimensional in nature, compared with the partial equilibrium approach of the MVI. Second, it introduces a very important methodological shift from an index to a framework that we can customize to fit the particular circumstances of a country or region when an event takes place, right? It is forward-looking, and it therefore enables the policymaker to make better decisions based on probable and possible scenarios. It also facilitates real-time analysis of the evolving state of vulnerability and resilience. And importantly, it moves away from a time measure and introduces the concept of internal resilience capacity as a basis for expanding access to finance. So these are some fundamental areas we think that are critical in terms of strengthening that MVI framework. On a practical level, we have been doing a lot of work on this measure, and I would want to say that we're making very strong advance. So we are looking at measuring this duration of recovery by comparing the gap between the natural growth path, that MVI baseline path that the country would have traveled in the absence of a shock, and the new path that the economy travels once a shock materializes. So I think a crucial distinction here in the framework is that the RDA framework recognizes when a vulnerability materializes. And it is important to take account of that for SIDS and small countries. I would perhaps, before I come back in, just also lay on the table that on the financing front, we are emphasizing the importance of a financing ecosystem that can provide adequate and affordable finance to meet the needs of our regions. And in this regard, we are looking at financing for rescue, financing for recovery, and financing for long-term repositioning, right? And we think that there is need for a suite of instruments that can be combined coherently to manage these diverse needs, while of course providing the adequate governance safeguards. To support the work of the RD methodology, we are also in the process of developing what we'll call a vulnerability and resilience assessment tool that could provide monitorable vulnerability and resilience metrics that can look at the cost for mitigation and policies to address key deficiencies. And we envisage that these tools can be linked to the national development goals and mapped to national budgets. So we think this framework is a framework that actually incorporates elements of the MVI, and therefore to that extent, the MVI we think is naturally subsumed under our vulnerability and resilience framework. So I wanted to just put those points on the table as an opener. And then, of course, we will get into some of the discussions as we go forward. Thanks a lot, Chair.
Thank you so much, Shelton. And it's interesting to note the work of the CDB, and also how the CDB envisions the adjuster, as I would call it, in working along the same lines of the MVI, and perhaps how it can complement or improve the MVI. I think in all the conversations, I think none is more important, or it is important to have the perspective of our developed partners. And so I know that the UK has been working tirelessly on the issue of access to climate and development finance for SIDS. And so I would allow Ambassador Woodruff to share some of the views from the UK government. Ambassador?
Tomasi, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay. Really very interesting conversation indeed. And if I might take us right back to the start, I think it was Ambassador Webson who described it as a difficult and awkward conversation. It might be, but I don't think that means that we should shy away from having it. I'm sure he would agree. I think he would also agree, though, that, and I imagine other colleagues on the call might as well, that to quote my ambassador, it's time that we stopped admiring the problem. We know what the problem is. We've talked a lot about the problem. We now need to focus on moving to solutions and moving to action. And I hope that this conversation today is yet another opportunity for us to advance that dialogue forward. And it feels to me that we're at a sort of slight inflection point as well, and that there is a kind of momentum behind this debate that hasn't really existed before. And I think, if I may, that's largely down, I think, to the tireless efforts of the current chair of OASIS and previous chairs of OASIS to raise this up the UN agenda. So I think there are opportunities now, and I think the establishment of the President of the GA's MVI panel is one such, to really start exploring where can we take this conversation and where can we unlock opportunities to make progress that didn't necessarily exist before. So I think for us as the UK, and obviously I can't speak for the whole of the donor community, I can only speak on behalf of the UK. I think essentially what we see as the issue that needs to be resolved is, in summary, that development partners finally need to step up and reform what are clearly a series of broken policies and broken approaches, and a series of policies and approaches that don't work and that don't reflect the reality on the ground. And so for us, for the UK, there are 4 issues that we feel are critical, and on which I'd actually welcome views as to whether others share those views. But for us, there are 4. The first is access to concessional finance. And there will be many on this call who are familiar with what is called the call to action on access to concessional finance that we, with Oasis, Belize and Fiji, launched last year. I won't get into the detail of that because we've talked about it before, but this year has to be a real focus on delivering the recommendations in that call to action, specifically around debt, around ODA eligibility, and also around resolving the particularly onerous bureaucracies that exist around some of these issues. And so we will be working to mainstream or implement those recommendations into the mainstream here in New York and elsewhere. The second one is around the quality of finance, and that for us is a real priority issue. And again, there is another process that we have been working on with AOSIS colleagues, and this time with Canada, which is called the Principles to Improve Aid Impact. And that specifically looks at improving the quality and effectiveness of aid to SIDS. And there will be a series of guidance that will be launched at the end of this year. I think that is currently being worked through a series of regional consultations to refine and ensure that they are really going to deliver what we want. But as I say, that's something that we hope to launch with Oasis colleagues later on this year. But thirdly and critically, and I think this is particularly important for today's discussion, it's around issues, of course, of vulnerability. And as we've heard today, and as we know, GNI per capita is just a poor measurement of development. And ODA criteria really needs to take account of the particularly unique challenges that SIDS face. And that's something that we as the UK feel very strongly about. And for those of you who may have been at the Springs in Washington last week and may have heard one of my ministers speak there, I think it's her description that, the SIDS face a cliff edge when graduating from ODA eligibility, because they remain vulnerable to climate and economic shocks and a lack of other sources of finance to ensure resilience. And so the whole of the international system, in our view, must respond to that vulnerability in how it provides finance for countries on the front line of climate change. And the call to action that I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago specifically asks finance providers to review the potential for MVI to inform ODA decisions. And so we're looking forward to hearing the views of the PGA's expert panel, looking at those, I think importantly, alongside the other conversations that are taking place around different forms of MVI or different forms of measurement. And I think it will be incumbent upon us then to think about how all of these line up against each other and which are the ones that we may collectively wish to champion as we go forward. Finally, what I want to talk about, of course, climate finance. Now, I think it's fair to say that we achieved, various commitments in Glasgow around climate finance. And again, I want to pay tribute to AOSIS colleagues for helping us secure those. But if we really want to keep the 1.5 goal a reality, we have to get finance flowing, and we have to do more to push developed countries, MDBs, and the private sector to deliver on their commitments. Now, for us, we are still pushing that as COP president this year, of course. In Washington last week, the COP president was again urging developed countries to meet the 100 billion target, but also to double their finance for adaptation, which of course we know is a critical issue for SIDS. We hope that the Champions Group on Adaptation Finance that we established with a small group of other donor countries and is working alongside SIDS and LDC colleagues actually, about raising political attention and action on adaptation needs and priorities will deliver soon. That group is looking at reducing the barriers to increased quantity, quality, effectiveness, predictability, and accessibility of adaptation finance, all of which I think for us are really key issues which need to be resolved, and are working alongside the MDBs and the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action to help unpack some of those particular issues. The other thing I would say is, of course, the role of the MDBs. And again, when he was in Washington last week, COP President Sharma spoke to the leaders from the World Bank and the IMF to really press them on a more coherent approach between governments, MDBs, and the private sector to avoid unnecessary disbursement delays and bureaucracy so that finance can reach those who need it most. And I think it was really important to hear from the GCF on this particular issue. It's something we feel very strongly about. Indeed, Ambassador Webson, I think, is joining a conversation with my PR this week to talk specifically around some of the challenges that the SIDS face with regard to the GCF. So it's very heartening to hear that the board meeting that is taking place in Antigua and Barbuda in due course is going to be looking at some of those issues that the SIDS face and will be looking to resolve some of those issues. What I would say is I think it is also critically important that OASIS and other colleagues are encouraging all members of the board to approach those issues as constructively as possible so that we hope that we can see some progress there as well. And then finally, just one last thing I wanted to flag, and then I will stop talking, is the initiative that we have launched with Fiji, actually the Task Force on Access to Climate Finance, which we launched prior to COP26 in Glasgow, and is now, that task force is now running pilots in 5 countries, backed by £100 million of UK funding. And of course, in Glasgow, we also announced a new £40 million Small Island Developing State Capacity and Resilience Programme, which will support capacity building for small island states to better access funding and build state resilience. Now, I'm not saying that those are all of the answers or that that's a silver bullet, but I do hope that that gives you a sense both of the UK's commitment to addressing many of the issues that SIDS face in this arena, but also will be a constructive contribution for trying to find the solutions that are so urgently required. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Woodruff. And I do want to go on record and commend the UK government for all the support it has been providing to EOSIS and the different initiatives that you're involved in with Antigua and Barbuda as chair of EOSIS. I think it's also important for you to assist us in bringing other developed partners on board. And I'll come back to you with follow-up questions on how we could see other developed partners coming on board. But I think this is a good conversation now to allow Simona to come in here and probably provide some views. And I think it goes in relation to Simona on your original thought. And when you pronounced on the likely adoption of the MVI later this year, and I think the work that we're doing collaboratively will ensure that the MVI is adopted at the end of the year. But I think once the MVI is adopted, then we have to go into the next stage, and that would be implementation from the various stakeholders. Specifically, we try to target the IFIs, and I think this would go into some of the conversation that we'll have with the Carbon Development Bank. But how do you think we can bring the IFIs on board in accepting the MVI, which is critical for SIDS?
Thank you so much, Tomasia. And just to say that the UK is also extremely active in the Pacific, so I'm very grateful to the government of the United Kingdom for everything that is provided to the countries I cover myself in the Pacific, but across the region. Indeed, we need to agree on the next steps now. So first of all, the IFIs are being consulted. So the panel will have a meeting with the IFIs, I think on 28th of April, to start discussing and assessing the readiness of the international financial system to take on board the MVI as a complement to the GNI per capita. I just mentioned from the very beginning, that's still relevant, but unfortunately, it looks at linearity of development, which is no longer the case. What we want to do is to make very clear to the IFIs as to how the MVI links to the needs, because the MVI is a number. We need to ensure that the components that come into the MVI are actually linked logically, not only statistical correlation, it needs to be much more than that, to show how, for instance, living on low-lying lands, or how depending on remittances, or how export concentration is actually affecting livelihoods, and quantify the impact of this interplay of vulnerabilities, because otherwise we will not know how much the financial needs of the SIDS are. So that's an important step that needs to be made, and international financial institutions should be part of that conversation. So we very much rely on the approach that the panel took. And I'm having actually tomorrow another conversation with Australia, the member of the panel, on how this could be taken forward. Once we have a methodology that clarifies how vulnerability leads to SDG progress, to overall, unrealized economic potential, then we can design financial instruments. As discussed, we need indeed to have a guarantee fund for small island states. We need to have a compensation scheme. We need to have insurance schemes. We talked about converting SDRs, for instance, into disaster insurance for small island states. Should small island states be willing to use this instrument for that purpose? We spoke in Antigua also about the need to have some of the SDRs channeled through multilateral development banks. And that was on the other.
Those countries showing, right? So thanks for that question. But we have many examples, even from our cases in the Caribbean, Grenada, Dominica, St. Vincent. And indeed, we will also be applying the methodology to other countries across the world that are afflicted by other kinds of shocks, droughts, for example, in other SIDS. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shelton. I got disconnected. The hackers blocked me, so I could not log back in. But and I really wanted to come back in to Ambassador Woodruff because this is an important point, and I know you're hesitant to come in also. But I just wanted to draw on the point that Simona was making when we speak to the adoption of the MVI, and then we move into the implementation process, and noting that your ambassador, your minister spoke at the spring meetings last week. I think where we need to get support is within the IFIs. This is critically important for us. And so, and not to put you on the spot, Ambassador, but we're trying to get a commitment in itself from various different partners, especially those big players within the IFIs, on when the discussion comes to the boards of the IFIs, that they would advance the issue of the MVI, noting that we're not asking to replace GDP or GNI, but we're asking for the MVI to take it on board to complement. So perhaps you could share your views on the process that the UK government may be prepared to undertake in advocating or advancing the acceptance of the MVI within the IFI discussion.
Thanks, Mercy. Yes, I'll certainly give that a go. I mean, I actually, if you don't mind, I actually have a question for Mr. Nichols as well, but I will come on to that in a moment. In response to your question, Mercy, I think for those of you who may have had the opportunity to meet my Minister Ford, when she was in New York a few weeks back, and I think she met certainly some of the people on this call, she was very clear, and she is very determined that she personally and the UK will do what we can and what she can to advocate on behalf of the SIDS, using our membership of the various boards. And I know that she is extremely committed to that. So I would say, in response to your specific question, Matthew, that I think you're slightly pushing at an open door with the UK, I think, and certainly we will support your efforts to build wider political support behind all of the issues that we've talked about today. The question I have, if I may, and you'll need to forgive me because I'm not an expert on the detail of MVI, and there's a question I have for Mr. Nichols, is how does MVI line up against the other vulnerability indices that are currently being looked at, including through the Commonwealth, and the conversations that are obviously taking place within the Commonwealth Development Bank as well. We know that the Commonwealth is talking about a universal vulnerability index. How do we bring all of these conversations together around a set of principles which secures as wide a buy-in as possible from both the donor community, but also recipient states, because it strikes me that there is a potential challenge in having different proposals on the table, and we will then spend a long time trying to navigate what those different proposals are. So how quickly can we move to a point where there is broad, widespread agreement around one particular set of ideas and proposals? I don't know if Mr. Nichols is able to answer that, but that was the question that I was pondering as I was listening to the conversation earlier.
Okay, thanks. I will jump in a little bit to make a really important point on the vulnerability issue. And I think it's a really important point to recognize that for us as SIDS who want to argue on this question of vulnerability, we need to also know that even developed countries can face the same vulnerability from a hazard or from a shock. Right, and that's a very important point for us to understand. So we need something, or we need a measure that really incorporates the question of vulnerability, but goes beyond, looks at the actual internal resilience capacity of the country to rebound from these vulnerabilities. This is really the important element that we need to add. The question of resilience is crucial to this whole debate. And I think leaving it out would, means that we don't give ourselves the opportunity to actually explore that issue properly and to build the kinds of resilience that we want to avoid some of the vulnerabilities that our countries are facing or continue to face. So the resilience component is really crucial. From our point of view, I have said that our framework actually recognizes the importance of the multidimensional vulnerability index, looking at different elements of vulnerabilities, whether these are on the econ side, the environmental side, and the social side. So that, I think there is good enough understanding of how that framework works, but we need to add the resilience component to that, to allow us to have a more all-embracing framework that really allows us to address the question of access to finance. I think we stand a better chance to get the additional finance if we are talking about building resilience in our countries. We have existing vulnerabilities. We know that they create tremendous difficulties for countries, but we also have to look at crowding in the additional finance we need to build that resilience over time. And we see those two concepts as really important for SIDS going forward. So in broad measure, I think I want to re-emphasize the importance of that resilience element in the framework.
Thank you so much, Shelton. And I see the World Bank is asking to come in, but quickly, on Ambassador Woodruff question regarding the various work that is being done there, and the possibility of a conflict in the various proposals that are on the table. And I think this is the work that the expert panel is currently taking on board, listening to the work that the other stakeholders have been doing, and trying to see how we can perhaps provide a bridge onto the different proposals that are out there, and hopefully there's a consensus on one MVI that goes forward. I had another follow-up question for you, Ambassador, but I'll come to that later, and because you did mention the Commonwealth, but I'll give you a little time now, and I'll go to the World Bank.
I just wanted to build a little bit on Mr. Nichols' point on resilience, saying that if we're thinking of also attracting multiple investors so that we get this resilient development we've been talking about, one important thing we need is a sort of a signal, a labeling on investments which are being designed in the right way, so that if projects are well designed so that they can resist today's risks, but also tomorrow's risks, there is a way for investors and decision makers to know that those projects have been well designed and increase their attractiveness for investors from multiple places. This is something on which we've been working with what we call the resilience rating system, which is basically a series of steps that project developers should follow. And if they follow the right steps, they can be have such a label, and we hope that we can help project developers develop the right projects by guiding them in terms of what do they need to do that, but also if they do their job well, making it visible so that projects that are more resilient are prioritized. And I think it's a very important part of this very multidimensional discussion about how to attract more finance, showing that the project we're talking about are good projects that will be resilient, that will still be there in 20 years and not washed away by a disaster.
Thank you. The participants who are viewing the discussion, if you do have questions, you could also raise your hand and we would allow you to come in. Maybe just to quickly move to the Green Climate Fund and their simplified access, and noting that the upcoming meeting in Antigua and Barbuda will perhaps improve the simplified access. And I note that the GCF is also working on the concept of ensuring that vulnerability is taken more into consideration in the allocation of financing. But are there any consideration from the GCF's perspective on how they can be engaged in the process and the discussions on the MVI now, and how the MVI could be incorporated once adopted into the work from the Green Climate Fund? Mr. Velasquez?
Many thanks. There are, as part of the discussion that's happening now on the simplified approval process, there is one proposal in there in relation to presumptive climate rationale, which in fact will ease the requirements for projects, especially adaptation projects from SIDS, because it presumes already that these adaptation projects are actually climate projects. Now, in addition to this, there's another paper, a policy that's coming from the GCF, and that is on the climate rationale policy, which will form the basis of what requirements will form the basis for adaptation projects for GCF in general. Because as we all know, being a climate fund, a fundamental concept is that projects need to be based on science and some climate basis. So coming up with a policy on what basis that could be done based on the availability and limits, which could be based on region or country, would be a useful guide so that it then becomes a basis without further back and forth for determining not just many things, not just the hazards, but also vulnerability and also exposure. And also, in addition to that, the kind of interventions that are proposed to actually deal with these vulnerabilities, hazards, and exposure. So it could be used maybe at some point, because at this point, there are no universal approach yet for this kind of data, especially for adaptation. And we believe that this kind of policy would be useful, not just for the GCF, but maybe for other institutions as well.
Great, thank you. I will give the floor to Kenneth from Micronesia, but before I do so, Ambassador Woodruff, I told you that I had another question for you. And so you could ponder on my question, and then I will allow Kenneth to come in and pose a question. But I wanted to come in here because you did bring up the work that the Commonwealth is doing on their universal MVI, and so noting that the Commonwealth is they're working on their universal MVI, and it will be adopted, I understand, at CHOGM in June. Then and noting that the UK is also a big player within the Commonwealth, how would you accept the Commonwealth Universal UVI, their UVI, and also if there's a decision on the MVI, how would the UK try to maneuver between the UVI and the MVI? I know it's probably a loaded question, but you could give us some thought. I'll let Kenneth come in here.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm not certain if this was answered by Dr. Nichols, but I wanted to direct these questions to him. Can you elaborate more on the indicators that will be used to determine the internal resilience capacity metric? And in trying to capture the nuances of of a country's particular initial conditions, do you sacrifice universality as a result? Thank you.
Thank you, Kenneth. So that question was for Dr. Shelton, but Ambassador Woodruff, if you have any response for me, please go ahead.
Yeah, so let me just jump in. The way we have actually designed this, our methodology actually builds firstly on a number of the indices that actually a framework that actually produced by the UN. So certainly in the context of production resilience, we look at a number of things. We look at market efficiency. We look at elements of macroeconomic stability. In terms of elements of resilience, of course, we look at capital formation. We look at environmental performance, etc. Financial resilience, we look at access to finance and financial capacity. So many of the indicators we're using in our framework are aligned in essence to what is already there. So in a sense, we are not, it is generic enough to incorporate and embed existing indicators. And then, of course, we can customize specifically on the resilience elements for particular countries. So that's the first point I want to make. A second point that I think would be crucial in the context of our framework, which I mentioned in my opening statement, is really the importance of the vulnerability and resilience assessment tool, right? I think this is critical. For instance, if you look at even the work of the fund or the World Bank and other institutions, the fund has a financial sector assessment program, the FSAP, to really allow it to understand the risks in the financial sector, the vulnerabilities in the financial sector. I was, for instance, a part of the FSSR development that looked at financial stability and that kind of assessment. We need a similar tool that will allow us, besides just getting the indicator numbers from the countries, to really take a deeper dive on the vulnerabilities and resilience. And we think this would be a crucial part of the framework to actually support and provide the evidence-based information to actually support the numbers. And this we think is critical to be able to customize specific policies for countries. So in the RDA framework, we are taking on board the vulnerabilities, but we're also trying to ensure that there is an assessment tool that would allow us to take a deeper dive on the vulnerabilities and the resilience so that we can better target policies to build resilience and to accelerate development. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Shelton. Ambassador Woodruff, maybe you may want to attempt my question.
I will give it a go, Tomasi. I will give it a go, but I'll also be quite brief because I'm conscious of time and I'm sure there are others who will have views as well. I think what I would say is this probably comes back to my previous comment about just being aware of the fact that there are obviously these conversations taking place in different fora, in different constituencies, with applicability to different groups of countries, etc. I guess what I would say, and I'm sure you would agree, is that it is key that we move as quickly as possible to coalescing around a particular set of, or a particular idea or a particular set of ideas, because the longer that we have what are potentially competing proposals on the table, the more that it just remains a tool in name only, as opposed to a tool that will have practical effect. Now, I don't have an answer to how we quite get there, and I don't have an answer as to what exactly might come out of CHOGM later this year versus what exactly might come out of the panel later this year. But I think that the key for me is how we best capitalize on the momentum that is finally resulting in progress being made on the indices, and an appetite, I think a broad appetite to really examine them in detail, understand their applicability, but also move from theory to practice. And I think the key for us will just be ensuring that there is as broad political buy-in as possible, across the international community behind a set of ideas that we can then champion, because I think we know that there are still some countries who I think are skeptical or questioning of MVI. So we need to move quite quickly behind one set of ideas that we can then collectively champion, would be my half answer for you.
No, thank you.
Tomasi, may I come in here a second, because I think we also want to just make an important point. Agreeing on the RDA or taking those resilience components into effect does not actually stop the work going forward on the MVI. From our point, as we said in the CDB, we see that as a first stage. We see the MVI as an important first stage, but we need to add the resilience components. So it doesn't create a problem in terms of our framework. Our framework will in fact incorporate the MVI, but allow the resilience components to be built in. So we don't see any incongruence between these goals. Yeah.
Thank you, Shelton. Maybe just a quick follow-up, and I know that we're pressed for time and we have to wrap up now, especially before the hackers get us again. But just quickly, Shelton. So the adjuster, and maybe you had answered this during my brief departure, but the adjuster is meant to be a long-term measurement of a country's vulnerability, and so this is how it complements the MVI.
The adjuster is an application. So what we're actually doing with the adjuster, as mentioned in the case of Dominica, is using the IRC to really adjust GNI to the appropriate levels that will actually take consideration of those vulnerabilities and resilience gaps, if you want to put it like that. So if you're hit by a hurricane, for instance, and your economy is totally decimated, there's no way that your GNI per capita remains at 8,000. It actually will fall. And therefore, what our IRC measures does, right, is looks at that evolution over time and makes the relevant adjustment, right? So it's an application of that principle. And we hope to be able to demonstrate that. We're hoping at some stage we can come back to the group and actually demonstrate how this works. We're actually in the process of doing some of our simulations for the various countries, and we will look forward to an opportunity, in a few weeks' time to actually demonstrate how that mechanism works.
Thank you, Shelton. And I will now hand the floor over to Ambassador Latoro, who will do the closing. But just to indicate that this conversation for us will be continuous. We will have other opportunities to engage on the MVI, on access to finance, and how we can really ensure that we're able to build the resilience of SIDS. So we're looking ahead at perhaps another event during HLPF. And also then, of course, we will send invites to everyone for the Wadadli Action Platform that will be held in Antigua later in August. And perhaps this may be a good avenue where the CDB can showcase how the adjuster would work. Again, thank you for your engagement, and I'll hand the floor over to Ambassador Latoro of Samoa, who will do the closing.
Thank you very much, Tomasi. And can I start by just thanking all our speakers and the panelists for their very interesting and sometimes thought-provoking contribution. Perhaps at this stage, just to say a few things, because I know some of us has to run off to some other commitment, but I think the point that was made earlier on, that this issue of the MVI is not an easy one, because if it was, we would have resolved this some time back. So I think that gives us a clear indication that it has a difficult issue, but I think we're seeing, or at least we hope, that we are now down the final stretch in terms of agreeing on the MVI. I think one of the other points that have been made is certainly in terms of how we envisage this to be used. I think there's been a contribution in terms of access to concessional financing, the link to the issue of debt, and of course, when we face the economic recovery that must come after COVID, I think it's extremely important for our 6 member states to ensure that we have the MVI approved. I think it's also important to perhaps keep in mind the process between now and September, when hopefully we will have this through the General Assembly, the 77th session, for endorsement. But what is of critical importance, and I think this has been acknowledged during our conversation today, is that we have to take everyone that is critical to this process with us, especially our development partners, the IFIs, which has been acknowledged, because at the end of the day, it's the implementation, actual implementation of the MVI that is of critical importance. So I think we also got to keep that in mind. I am very pleased to hear, Ambassador UK, in terms of your presentation. I think the points that you have raised in terms of the need to reform broken procedures and regulation strike a chord with me as somebody that has sort of studied development ODA policy for a long time. And I think that one of the key things that we have to keep in mind as well is that ODA is still on the table. The commitment in terms of 0.7 should not be forgotten. And that I think what is also critically important is that what we are looking at is real additional money. I think we're not looking at some creative accounting process where you take from one pocket to another, because I think that will create another crisis. You're trying to solve the climate crisis and you're gonna find yourself in another crisis because, in the words of the Secretary General, no country should be put in a situation where they have to choose between meeting their SDGs obligation and, of course, debt, which will come because of the COVID. So I think, we have to look at that. I think our partners, development partners, I hope that they will continue to look at that commitment of 0.7 in terms of ODA. But I think the IFIs is perhaps where the potential also is in terms of real money. And I think that is a well that we will need to look at in terms of the future. And finally, on this issue of the URI or the MVI, and in particular the Commonwealth Index, I have been involved in the context of that discussion. I left, and I did ask the question during the presentation because my understanding was that that cannot be endorsed during the CHOCOM meeting because it hasn't been discussed, but I might have been wrong because I've been away from London for nearly a year now, but I do not recall having that discussion. So I think it's important also because the coherence between all these indices and bringing them together. Otherwise, you're going to have conflicting bases and foundation upon which these are based, and I think that will lead to further delay in terms of the adoption and the implementation of the MVI. So I think we need to coordinate, we need to be in touch. But I think, my own personal view as a member of the high-level panel is that I think what is here in New York, I think that's where the lead should be. I think we have taken on board some of the recommendation or at least some of the issues that have been put forward. I think one of the key things is to keep the MVI simple and understandable so that everyone can come on board. So let me conclude by thanking each and every one of you for your contribution. And as Tomas was saying, this conversation continues. It's not certainly by no means that at the end, we still got to run those few miles before September. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you.